Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad that you joined us for this first presentation in our 2021 Biennial Conference, 1946 Reconsidered, the post-World War II Ohio Valley. Before I turn over this roundtable to its moderator, John McNay, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our event sponsors, the CE&S Foundation, and an anonymous friend of the Filson. The work of organizing these sessions and following them up with peer-reviewed publications, further research, and public commemoration of the topics presented here would have been impossible without their support. Thank you again for joining us for this afternoon's roundtable on post-war higher education. Education and housing, which we'll touch on tomorrow, are some of the most resonant changes to post-World War II America, and not coincidentally, two of the things that most drive contemporary policy fights and calls for greater and more equitable access. I'm honored to host this distinguished lineup that we have here and couldn't be happier to lead off our conference with this group. With that, I'll turn over the program to John McNay, Professor of History at the University of Cincinnati-Blue, who will introduce our panelists.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I teach history at UC Blue Ash, as Patrick points out. I'm a Cold War historian, so I'm especially interested in this period, and I think we have a really wonderful lineup of great historians here who are going to be able to explain some of the principal issues that the field of higher education faced just after World War II. The first historian I'm going to introduce is Dr. Terry Birdwhistell. He's the founding director of the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History and former dean of UK libraries. He is currently senior oral historian in the Nunn Center. During his nearly 50 years at UK, he's also served as university archivist and associate dean of special collections and digital programs. He's past president of the National Oral History Association, and he served 2 terms on the advisory committee for records of Congress and presently serves on the steering committee for UK's Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues. Next is Carrie Daniels. She's the University Archivist, Director of Archives and Special Collections, and Professor in the University Libraries at the University of Louisville. Her recent professional and scholarly work focuses on the development of community-centered archives, and she has a great article on this called Saving All the Freaks on the Life Raft, Blending Documentation Strategy with Community Engagement to Build a Local Music Archives. And she's also focused on the preservation of digital materials. Her first research, her love really, was the history of higher education. She earned a master's in education and completed coursework toward a doctorate in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where her research focused on the evolving recognition of student and faculty First Amendment rights in public institutions of higher education throughout the post-World War II period. Dr. John Harding, his central scholarly interests are 20th century African-American history. In 2015, the University Press of Kentucky published the Kentucky African-American Encyclopedia. He served as one of the 3 general editors of this unique book. Also, while at Western Kentucky University, he served as an elected member of the governing board of the Kentucky Historical Society and is appointed member and vice chair of the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission. His publications include the following books: Onward and Upward, A Centennial History of Kentucky State University, 1886 to 1986. 50 Years of Segregation, Black Higher Education in Kentucky, 1904 to 1954. And The Pursuit of Excellence, Kentucky State University, 1886 to 2020. He has chapters in the following books: Community Memories, A Glimpse of African American Life in Frankfurt, Commemoration of Western Kentucky University's Integration, 1956 to 2006. He's published several articles, the Green Pinckney Russell of Kentucky Normal and Industrial Institute for Colored Persons in the Journal of Black Studies, Green Pinckney Russell Francis Marion Wood in the Kentucky Normal and Industrial Institute, 1912 to 1929, a study in politics and race in the Filson Club Historical Quarterly, and maybe the most interesting titled, Kentucky is More or Less Civilized. Alfred Carroll, Charles Eubanks, Lyman Johnson, and the Desegregation of Kentucky Higher Education, 1939 to 1949. That appeared in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. And finally, but not least, is my colleague, David Stradling, who's the Zane L. Miller Professor of Urban History at the University of Cincinnati. He's the author of several books, including The Nature of New York, an environmental history of the Empire State, also Making Mountains, New York City and the Catskills, also Smokestacks and Progressives, Environmentalist Engineers and Air Quality in America, 1881 to 1951. And with Richard Stradling, Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland. Most recently, and with great relevance, he wrote In Service to the City, A History of the University of Cincinnati. So what I'd like to do is to direct perhaps first to Dr. Hardin a question about integration and segregation. When a lot of the GIs were coming back from World War II, they faced a segregated context. And just as today, when we're having a great deal of difficulty struggling with this same problem, I think Dr. Hardin might shed some light on the struggles that went on in this period right after World War I with the attempted desegregation of the institutions of higher education.
Okay, let me just, first of all, I'm still, let's see, I need to get my video on. Okay. Am I on video? Okay. Let's just go ahead. The central problem at the end of World War II, coming back to an area that still held in place segregation, and it's one of those sets of circumstances where everyone wanted to come back and participate in higher education, and it simply was not doable because, at least in Kentucky, the day law was still in place. There was at one point, coming back to the state, an attempt to create a higher educational institution equal to the University of Kentucky in 1944 by Representative Dorman. And that particular attempt failed because the legislature wanted to really keep everyone segregated. So that attempt to create a sort of a black version of the University of Kentucky simply failed in the legislature. And there were other attempts to sort of desegregate the state. It simply did not work. It was one of those situations where segregation was more important, but at the same time, African Americans who participated in the war, particularly served as Tuskegee Airmen, some of whom were trained to defend the country, and they were coming back. These were intelligent people ready to come back. They had one opportunity to go to school, and that was in segregated facilities in Kentucky. Some went to places like the University of Cincinnati and other places outside of the state. They could not attend any place but Kentucky State College for Negroes at the time. That was the title. It later was changed to, of course, Kentucky State and then to Kentucky State University. Most of my research focuses on the point that the state of Kentucky was very unwilling to desegregate. Attempts to sort of change all of this failed in the courts. A lawsuit against the University of Kentucky in 1941 by Charles Lamont Eubanks failed. He tried, he was an A student. He wanted to go into engineering. There was an attempt to create an engineering school, litigation. Thurgood Marshall, who eventually became a member of the Supreme Court, was on his legal team. The statement you made in one of my articles said, Kentucky is more or less civilized. That was Marshall's quote about Kentucky. At one point, he said, Kentucky is more or less civilized when it came to race. The reality was, it was just as uncivilized as other southern states. It refused. It had a day law from 1904, which prohibited integrated education. So all of this is simply to say, at the post-war era, Kentucky was not changing. It was very reluctant to change in terms of desegregated education. It was, in so many ways, a sort of traditional Southern state, although it was a border state. It said that it was different. A 1945 commission called the Commission on Negro Affairs said things were doing better in Kentucky on some things. Voting, blacks could vote in Kentucky, but on other things, race was an impediment. So at the end of the war, 1946, there was on one level a sense of perhaps things will get better, but they weren't getting any better. People were coming back. There were incidents, the very famous incident, but nationwide, 3 black WACs, Women's Army Corps, were beaten up in Elizabethtown near Fort Knox. The military, in its wisdom, decided to acquit the female black soldiers, send them out of state. They were arrested initially for being beaten up by whites. Their crime was being beaten up. And as a result, they had to be sent out of state so that they could survive. So at the end of the post-war period, situations in terms of higher education and race were problematic. Kentucky State was existing. Louisville, University of Louisville had Louisville Municipal College, which had been in place since 1931. It was functioning, but it was a limited opportunity. And if you wanted to do anything, you had to leave the state. So I'll stop right here because I could go on a little bit longer, but I'll stop right here. Does that help you start?
Yes.
For the pot?
That's great, John. You know, I had initially planned to let all of you do some introductory statements here. So why don't we continue along that line?
Okay.
Carrie Daniels, do you think you could jump in?
Or would you like me just to read what I was gonna, my 5-minute introduction? Okay, great. So I'm from University of Louisville, and we experienced and participated in most of the things that affected higher education in the post-war period. You know, the enormous growth in the population of traditional college-age students, coupled with increased levels of participation in higher ed, the long civil rights movement, and an increased push toward research and identifying as a university. I'm sorry, are you all getting a lot of feedback from me? Okay. I'm not sure what to do about that.
You could try turning your volume down, maybe.
Okay, I've done that. Okay. So for University of Louisville, actually desegregation was a very big part of our history in this post-war time, for many of the reasons that Dr. Harden noted. You know, LMC was brought into existence, I think, really through the political will of Louisville's Black communities, and they were also key players in desegregating, which ultimately brought the end of Louisville Municipal College. There's a lot to say around that and around how that was handled. It was obviously the right thing to do for U of L to integrate in 50 for the graduate programs and 51 for undergraduate. But it was handled not as a merger, but as dissolution of LMC. So there, while the Belknap campus, the undergraduate white campus was perfectly calm and everything desegregation went just fine. Everybody was at least fine with it, if not supportive. There was this great loss, I think, on the part of LMC faculty, staff, students, and alumni. And I think that's something that, you know, we continue to unpack and deal with. Other demographic changes had a significant impact on U of L. The city's population and support for the university right after World War II grew And it was this wonderful, imaginative, crazy, experimental time in the history of Louisville, and in other parts of the country. But U of L focused a lot of energy on trying to bring folks into higher education's ambit who hadn't been there before. So we did, we offered credit courses on the radio and television. We created neighborhood colleges in conjunction with the Free Public Library. So colleges actually out in the community, if you will. And we partnered with corporations like Seagram's and LNN and did coursework through our division of adult education, which grew by leaps and bounds. It was huge. At the same time, though, we were venturing into doctoral programs. We offered our first doctoral programs in the sciences in the 50s. Our faculty, a larger portion of them had the PhD, and more of them were doing research. So we were headed in that direction as well. We opened the Institute for Industrial Research affiliated with our Speed School of Engineering, and our Institute for Medical Research, obviously affiliated with the med school. And these were designed to facilitate research. We became more complex institution. We added new schools, including the Southern Police Institute and a business school. And we also, in this immediate post-war period, saw the baby boom looming on the other side of this like post-GI trench, where we were the college-going population would sink. And we pointed out the need for many new facilities, including for us, our first dorms. Until our first dorm was built in 1959, male students were put up in what had been a barracks building for the V-12 program during World War II, and our female students, those that could fit in a converted house, had on-campus housing. And the last thing I would say is that during this time, there was something else that was looming on the horizon for us. That was sort of a confluence of our aspirations to true university status, our desire to open up an affordable higher education option in the state's largest city, and Louisville's shrinking population beginning in the 60s. This sort of perfect storm, if you will, resulted in our entry into the state system in July of 1970. And I realize that's getting kind of probably beyond our chronological framework here, but you know, for us, that's sort of lurking there ahead on the other side of many of these other issues.
All right, thanks very much. Dr. Birdwhistell, could you go next, please?
Carrie, you're muted.
I'm muted. How about that? Is that better?
That's good. Yep.
I don't know why that switched off. I want to sort of set up the University of Kentucky in the 1940s. The people who were on campus when the war began, they remembered as the campus is changing seemingly overnight, you know, as men left for the service, and a lot of women left too. You know, it wasn't just men leaving higher education at that time for very various and complex reasons. And so when I first started looking at the World War II period at UK, just like the story nationally, you know, it says, well, you know, the women ran the campus. It was all women, you know, it was no men on campus. And it doesn't take long to find out that that wasn't true. And so the last chapter in the book that Deirdre Skaggs and I did on the history of women at UK through the Second World War was that numbers sometimes lie. And so what that means is, just like at Louisville, and I'm not sure about Cincinnati and Western, but large numbers of military men came to campus, and probably were more men on campus during World War II than there had been before World War II. And so I interviewed several women here during the war, and they tell a story about a university student who now had a little more money. The war generated more money. And coming off the Depression, this made a difference for the students. And as this student told me, she said, when you went over to the cafeteria, she said, there were men everywhere. You had your choice. And she finally looked at me and said, I probably shouldn't say this. It was a terrible time, but it was the most fun I ever had. So that sort of, sets the stage, for what these campuses were like. Now, women had struggled to get equal treatment in the university. And of course, it still wasn't there by the 1940s. But what happened after the war, as John said about the desegregation and things, so many things didn't change. For women, things did change. They changed for the worse again. And I want to read you something. And this is, women were part of the problem, if you will, because a woman writing in the Kernel in 1943 said, the Rosie the Riveter may be one of the girls you dated in college days who then went to dances and teas and was strictly a lady. She's still a lady, even if she's doing a man's work, and she'll be a lady after the war when you come home. There will still be a home when you return, and there will still be the same life you knew before December 7th, 1941. The change now has been a definite one, but it's just for the moment we win the war. The theory of the quote unquote Amazon woman will disappear and she will go back to her duties in the home. The average co-ed is confident of this, even in the midst of confusion. So in 1943, this woman student was anticipating part of the problems that women would encounter. And so in the mid-40s, UK put together a post-war planning committee, and Dean Sarah Holmes, Dean of Women, got herself put on that committee, fortunately. And what she saw happening during this period was all the planning was for returning men students, and she thought it was at the expense of the women. And she said, she noted that women were being told to wait their turn, then added, but there is not turn in higher education for women. So there were women who were standing up and saying, we can't have all these returning veterans educated at the expense of women. But by the fall of 1946, 80% of the male students at the University of Kentucky were veterans, and men outnumbered women 5-1. So it went back fairly quickly. And as a matter of fact, UK capped women's enrollment for a time so that they could enroll more men. So that's how bad it was. During the war, women first got to play in the school band. Before that, they weren't allowed to play in the band. And so that was a big breakthrough, even though, John, they called it the best band in Dixie, as a matter of fact, as you know, and played Dixie until the 1960s at the University of Kentucky. When the war ended, the women were kicked out of the band, and the men in the band said, well, now we can get back to our high standards. So it just permeated the atmosphere. And John mentioned, UK remained segregated until Lyman Johnson 1949, undergraduates in 1954. But it was a long, long struggle to get Black students at the University of Kentucky and to have them feel welcome. I interviewed a person who came in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, and had a room in a dormitory. He went in, met his white roommate. He left, and then when he came back, the roommate had moved out. So it was that kind of atmosphere. So I want to talk just a little bit about facilities. Of course, as Carrie said, there's a great need for, with these influx of students and programs of buildings. And UK had a lot of the surplus Army buildings, and there's still one on campus today, as a matter of fact. And then, of course, we had to build temporary housing for all the married students, and which became known as Cooperstown. But it's an urgent need for buildings. And so, this is Kentucky. So what did they do? They made the priority building after the war, the building of a basketball arena. Memorial Coliseum feeding 11,500, the largest on-college campus facility in the South. And to add insult to injury, they tore down a vibrant Black neighborhood and built the Memorial Coliseum on that site, just across Euclid Avenue from the university. And so in a football promotional booklet, they bragged that UK was very fortunate to have a president who loved athletics. And at that time, we had both Adolph Rupp and Bear Bryant as our coaches. So that's the atmosphere at Kentucky. We'd gotten a new president in 1941 named Herman Lee Donovan. He'd been president of Eastern Kentucky University. He had his doctorate from Peabody in education. The faculty went nuts that he was going to be named president, but he ended up being a fairly strong leader, often compared to Harry Truman in his kind of his mannerisms. But members of the faculty at the time in oral history interviews have said that this is when UK really missed its opportunity, that President Donovan and other administrators at UK who had come through the Depression knew how bad funding was for higher education in Kentucky, were so worried that they would go bankrupt, not knowing what the future was in this post-World War period, that they played it really conservative. And that while the Big Ten schools and other research universities around the country were really expanding and going aggressive, UK played it safe and then had to play catch up for the next several decades. And so what eventually changed it as we get into the more current, later period, was the creation of a medical school on campus, which changed the research atmosphere. But before that, it was a non-research university in a relatively small place. Lexington was a very small city at that time. So that just sort of gives you an overview of UK at that period.
Right, thank you. David Stradling, why don't you be next?
Thanks, John. Thanks for everybody for coming. It's good to see you. So when I was doing my research on the history of the University of Cincinnati, I kept a couple of big questions kind of foremost in my mind related to the mission of the institution. And they're very general questions. What is higher education for? And very relatedly, what are institutions of higher education for? And I think of World War II as being one of those watersheds where a couple of very important long-term trends get accelerated. And this is not just at the University of Cincinnati, but at most institutions around the country, certainly larger institutions like UC. One is the movement from thinking of higher education as being about creating leaders and better citizens to one of focus on employment. This is something that had been underway through much of the 20th century, but World War II really, I think, accelerates this dramatically, in large part because, as everybody's been saying, so many more students are coming into higher education, and they're not doing it because they think that they're going to be servants to civilization. They're doing it because they think they can get better jobs with the training that they get. And many of them come specifically for technical training. Engineering expands dramatically, medicine, of course, nursing, all kinds of very practical fields, secondary education areas. Very much job oriented. Those are the areas that expand most significantly in the post-war era. So that's one secular change that gets heightened dramatically after the war. And the other is very much related about who's coming into higher education altogether. And we've talked about the very, very slow progress of African Americans coming into higher education. I think that's just as true in Cincinnati as it is in Kentucky, even though there's not the formal bar of segregation. And in fact, in some ways, the fact that UC had never barred the entry of Black students made it difficult for people to figure out when they wanted to, and then for the longest time they didn't, why there weren't Black students at UC. And so there are all kinds of, in fact, we still haven't figured it out. Our percentage of Black students is roughly the same now as it was in the early 1960s, believe it or not. So there has been no progress. In that we're about 8%, 7 or 8% Black students at UC now, in a city that is about 50% African American. In any event, the movement of elite student body, folks who most often had parents who went to college, parents who had money, middle class folks, to a demographic that's still largely white, as I was saying, and still overwhelmingly male. But there's a real class shift in who's attending college after World War II in a very meaningful way. And of course, it amplifies that other secular change that I was just describing about emphasis on employment. But the one specific thing that I would like to emphasize about what's really revolutionary about the consequences of World War II has more to do with the federal government than just the fact of the GI Bill, which of course sent lots of students and thereby lots and lots of federal dollars through tuition into institutions of higher learning that could then grow to meet the demand, but also research dollars. And this is one way in which the University of Cincinnati changed dramatically after World War II, as the Cold War ramped up and as many, many more of those research dollars are tied directly to the Pentagon and related federal spending in science and engineering. The University of Cincinnati, its research mission becomes a leading feature. There had always been, from the very beginning, researchers at the University of Cincinnati, even when it was a very small school. But the chasing of research dollars, and particular research dollars from federal agencies, becomes the hallmark of a Research One institution, which is what Carnegie calls the University of Cincinnati, and lots of other large public institutions. Let me read to you. So thinking about that as a shift in mission for certain, I mean, it colors everything that happens on campus at the University of Cincinnati, but also I think it shifts kind of what it is that the ethics around what it is that professors are up to. I've found this really wonderful quote from University of Chicago Chancellor Robert Hutchins, who's one of those people who did an awful lot of thinking and writing about higher education. He was engaged in higher education for many, many decades. And he wrote at one point a really poignant question: why do university presidents cheerfully welcome the chance to devote their institutions to military preparations? And, this is a question that would become even more acute during the Vietnam War, but it's something that was already well underway as the Cold War ramped up in the late 1940s. So I'll leave it at that, John.
All right. Well, thank all of you. I think you've given us a good introduction to considering some of these important questions. One of the overarching questions that we deal with today, and certainly went through a lot of change back after World War II, was the funding issues at the different universities. And, the one thing I'm thinking about is that UC and Louisville have a thing in common where they were city universities that became state universities. Carrie, I wonder if you could shed some light on the decision to go that direction, and then maybe David, about what happened at UC.
Okay. Yeah, it's a long and complicated story of how Louisville became a state university. But as I said, we really kind of reached this point where we wanted to be a university rather than a liberal arts college. And we felt that Louisville, the city of Louisville being Kentucky's largest city, there needed to be a university, a state university near, in the area. And it made sense for that to be us. So it was sort of a combination of, we couldn't sustain the way of the path that we were on financially with just support from the city. To be honest, we had never, rarely been happy with the amount of support we got from the city. We were always wanting and needing more. But we reached a point where we couldn't really, it was not sustainable for us to continue on the path that we were on as a municipal, or as we called ourselves, semi-private institution. That always evokes in my mind a hospital room, but that's what we called ourselves, semi-private. Our tuition was actually more in line with Transylvania or Center. We were priced like a private liberal arts college rather than like a state university. So even in terms of our tuition, we looked more like a private school than a public school. And that kept a lot of our community members from enrolling. I mean, it was just too expensive. So, all those factors together kind of made it really our only path forward. And then it just became a question of what's it going to look like? And there were a lot of different ideas thrown around from, oh gosh, and Terry probably knows some of these too. There was a question of whether we should be part of UK, like a branch campus, or we could be sister colleges with our own chancellors and then one president over the whole thing. There were a lot of different ideas bandied about, and eventually, through a complicated process involving politics and various boards of trustees, settled on our independent entry into the state system in 1970. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I'm really curious to hear about Cincinnati. So
UC's experience is similar, of course. UC was a true municipal university, so it was from its founding in 1870, wholly owned and operated by the city of Cincinnati, which had some advantages to be locally controlled. It meant that it had the ability to, for example, move into a city park, Burnett Woods, and expand its campus because the city owned the land and could, in essence, just transfer it from one unit to another. It had the advantage of allowing them to commute all tuition for kids from the city for many decades. Students from Cincinnati did not have to pay tuition. But the problems really arose twofold, and they do get accelerated by World War II and its immediate aftermath. One of them is the stress of growth, as you were saying, Carrie. It's one thing to serve a population that is steady. It's another to try and build the facilities that you need to meet a growing demand. So the expansion, particularly of large science buildings and engineering buildings, which are incredibly expensive to build and equip, the upfront capital simply becomes untenable for the city of Cincinnati to borrow that money. Of course, cities are restricted in the amount of debt that they can take on. And the university is in competition with all other aspects that needed capital investment after World War II, sewers, roads, what have you. So there's only a certain amount of money in capital funds that the city was willing to put toward the expansion of the university. Because even though we were talking about the democratic nature of the shift in the population going to UC, it was still seen as kind of an elite institution, compared to, let's say, high schools or grade schools or city parks or sewers or water systems, whatever else city dollars might be focused to. So that was one thing. The stress of growth eventually requires that UC figure out another strategy, and really the only viable option was in the 1970s to become a state institution to get state dollars to pay for those new buildings. The other was the problem of the way in which the metropolis was changing after World War II, with the construction of highways, with white flight, the fact that large factories are built outside of the city of Cincinnati. The largest factory in Cincinnati still to this day is what's now and has been for a long time a GE plant that was built to build aircraft engines, jet engines, eventually, and during World War II. Outside of the city of Cincinnati, it becomes Cincinnati's largest employer, and it does not pay taxes to the city of Cincinnati. And you can amplify that, 100 times over about all of the folks who are taking themselves, their incomes, their jobs, their shopping outside of the city of Cincinnati. Their children might still consider going to the University of Cincinnati, and many of them did, but their tax dollars, local tax dollars, did not support that institution. So a tuition never covers the entirety of somebody's educational costs. So as the city becomes a smaller and smaller part of the metropolis, and particularly its tax base becomes smaller and smaller, again, it's simply not in a position to support an institution that is in essence serving a much larger demographic. And again, the logical and really the only viable option was to then go to the state and ask that it become part of the state system. I'll just close that with one irony, is that because UC was trying to pay for its own way, its tuition was actually, it was priced like a public school because it was a public school, but our tuition at UC was higher than it was at Ohio State because we had to get more of our dollars from tuition than from the general taxpayer. And it is still the case that it is more expensive to go to the University of Cincinnati than it is to go to Ohio State.
Yes, interesting. I wonder if this might incorporate John and Terry a little bit. We've talked about the issue with segregation. What about with faculty? How did the numbers of faculty in terms of African Americans and women change in the post-war period? John, could you help us with that?
Okay, here we go. Rephrase your question again.
Yeah, I'm wondering, we talked about the segregation of the universities, but what about the faculty? How did the faculty change? Did the faculty was there more opportunity or any change for African Americans on the faculty or for women?
Well, in terms of a place like Kentucky State, women were on board early on. There were women faculty teaching in mostly the liberal arts. After the war, you're going to see this transition, first of all, for a place like Kentucky State and the other teachers' colleges. And that's one thing we haven't talked about. Kentucky State was a teachers' college, so was Western, Eastern, Murray, and Morehead. All of these institutions were allowing teachers that they could get a hold of, staff that they could get a hold of, basically required to have at least earned a master's degree. One of the challenges was finding people willing to work at these smaller liberal arts institutions, sometimes not well funded. And of course, post-war period was a tough time. I know one of the institutions, Morehead, had a difficult time. They almost lost their accreditation because of certain other issues, political issues. But the whole point was this: each of the institutions had to figure out how they were going to function in a difficult time. The servile arts of science and things like that were more important. If you had a skill, that was more important. Why go to college and learn how to become a teacher? Whereas if you skip college and you had a skill that you learned in the military, you could get a real job. I think one of the points was that this post-war era was a transition from wartime to a period of prosperity, and there was a fuzziness. Some of the cities, Louisville, was trying to become industrialized versus agrarian. And if you were at the state institutions that were liberal arts teachers colleges, you were trained to be a teacher, but what were you trained to do something else? For example, Kentucky State lost its farm. It gradually faded away. It was one of the two land grant institutions. University of Kentucky was land grant, Kentucky State was land grant. And so you would think that those would be valuable, but for Kentucky State, it wasn't. Maybe for the University of Kentucky, it was. It had an active farm, but was it interested in developing an industrial base? Men were being employed to teach those courses, women, an afterthought. So in terms of gender equality on staff, that's always a big question, but I think more important to that is, in addition to gender, is what were you teaching? And the people to do the teaching on those campuses, receiving some of these people who were veterans, if there were women there, what were they trying to get? Were they trying to get teaching degrees? Were they trying to do something beyond the traditional women's roles, unfortunately, that is prescribed if you're a female? So each of the institutions outside of the University of Kentucky and that municipal private institution in Louisville, they were struggling with how to program what they're going to do. The money was not clear. It was just a challenge. And each institution that I've studied faced similar problems, and some had more unique problems because they were still new. Moorhead was still new. Murray State on the far western part. And the same way with Western Kentucky, same way with Eastern. And of course, there was one institution next to Cincinnati, which really wasn't in existence at the time. That's Northern. It comes up much later. So I'll cease.
All right, thank you. Dr. Birdwhistell?
Well, at UK, it was a long struggle still going on to hire and retain Black faculty. And that's an ongoing piece of work for the UK. After World War II, women who had been hired for the duration to teach were let go. And so women had to start at a much lower percentage of the faculty. I once said that if you look at the history of women teaching at UK, they remain at 20% over decades. And I said, you know, the men couldn't be doing this. They're not smart enough to make that happen. So something else must be at work to keep that cap on it. In regard to funding, UK, all universities are underfunded. We can agree because we work at universities, right? And there's never enough money. It's a big black hole. But UK can show how underfunded it has been in comparison to our peer institutions that but you hate to use the word, but we compete with. You know, if you look at the Big Ten schools, if you look at Ohio State's budget versus Cincinnati's budget, and it's like 3 times what our budget is. And so Herman Lee Donovan was right. You know, we were in hard times, and they were going to stay hard times for a while. And so when U of L comes into the system in 1970, Carrie, 1970, those of us at UK know where that money came from. It came right out of our hide. And then Northern comes in. And so Kentucky is a poor state. The higher education has competed with K through 12 for funding. And the legislature a lot of times goes for K through 12 because a lot of our legislatures haven't been to college. And so funding has been an issue. And as David said, those federal research dollars were just too enticing, and UK went after those in a big way. And of course, we developed a medical school in the 60s. That started our rise in terms of our ability to get research dollars.
Right. Patrick has asked a couple of interesting questions in the chat. One which he directs to Dr. Hardin is, what explains the separate integration of graduate and undergraduate programs? Were graduate programs seen as more achievable steps?
Well, graduate programs were perceived to be very narrowly defined, only for individuals who were at least college graduates They were not going to have any kind of on-campus roommates. In fact, many of those individuals had to find their own places. So graduate programs were going to be cases where a person would simply take their course. There's a very famous story with Tom Clark, who told one individual who was taking a graduate course where the students in the class were really didn't want him to sit in their classroom. So when he came to the class, they all sort of got out of their seats and he was sitting there in front of Professor Clark. Well, so goes it. He told the person who's a student, go get a cup of coffee. He was going to teach the students, talk to the students, resolve the issue. They came back and they had class. So graduate classes in so many ways were defined for a specific group. Now, there's a very famous case at the University of Kentucky where they tried to create a separate law school for a person who wanted to come from Kentucky State. Very famous case, the law school fought it, and they said, no, if we do this, we're going to, in a sense, lose our accreditation. So there were a lot of issues about having professional integration. It was easier, it was small, it was compressed, it was very narrow. The premise was it would avoid having Black men and white women in the same classroom. There was that nightmare. They did not want to have really racially integrated undergraduate classes. But professional classes, these were adults, very small group, very narrow. And besides, they could work around it. And again, doing some reading and research, you sort of come to the understanding that they were trying to sort of dodge the bullet. Brown versus Board of Education lawsuits were already in place in 1946. The first of those were getting ready to explode across the country. There had been a series of lawsuits in the 1930s. The Gaines case in 1939, there was a case in Missouri. All of these were aimed at graduate school. So the lawyers dealing with this knew that sooner or later, this was going to blow up. I'm reading some places that said, well, there were members of the Supreme Court saying, UK, get ready, it's going to happen. You have the graduate program that's going to be desegregated first. And this is why Lyman Johnson, and I think Terry, you can jump in on this. This is why the Lyman Johnson case was so significant. He already had a master's degree from the University of Michigan. I'm a Michigan alum. And so he was going to go to UK to get a PhD in history. And talking to Johnson before he passed, he said, I already had a very good graduate degree. Why do I need to go to UK? Well, I want to open the door for everybody else. That's what he told me. And so essentially it was easier to deal with the graduate programs first, then to open up the undergraduate program. Does this help?
John, I think sometimes he said, I already had a better graduate degree. And could I add something? At UK, with opening up the graduate program, it was mostly teachers in the city schools of Lexington. Everybody knew those teachers, and they were highly regarded people in the community. So it was much easier for the university.
David, I wonder if there's any kind of similar situation at Cincinnati.
Yeah, I've been thinking, but we've had exactly the same problem, of course, of recruiting and retaining, particularly faculty of color. I think that that's a long-term thing. As far as, so we're thinking about not the desegregation of programs, because that ours were always desegregated, but about the diversity of the faculty question. I think that UC was actually maybe a little bit better than some schools at retaining and attracting and retaining female faculty, in part because of the incredible diversity of programs that we had, and that there were areas where women were much more likely to be able to secure teaching positions. We had a very large normal school inside of the University of Cincinnati. We had a school for music, a school for nursing, all programs that had sizable female faculty fairly early on. One of my favorite stories of female faculty, however, is Lucy Brown, who got her PhD at UC in botany and biology and botany, and stayed on as a faculty member and became one of the more prominent researchers in botany in Ohio.
Right. There's another question that's been posed, and we're running a little short of time here, but obviously there's sort of a bump in enrollment because of the GIs, and then a bump in enrollment because of the baby boom. Are there any strategies in between there that you saw at these universities to try to work through that financial problem? Yes, David, go ahead.
I was reading that question too, and I was thinking, I saw nothing about that when I was reading, doing my research about UC, and I think partly because, you would imagine that there would be this, planning problem, given that people would be paying attention to how many students are in the pipeline. But the thing is that I think that the growth, it may be that the growth only slowed rather than stopped. Because at that point, we're still in the late 50s. We're still thinking about early and mid and late 50s, still talking about the expansion of the idea of who should be going to college, and not just the number of kids who are graduating from high school. So the demographics probably don't matter as much as the growing conception that almost anybody who can muster it should go and get a college degree. So the growth of UC, and plus the fact that it takes a long time for institutions to actually accommodate the growth that had already happened. So the buildings hadn't been built, right? It didn't have the GIs who came right after the war, were in Quonset huts and were crammed into buildings that weren't made for that kind of capacity. So it takes so long to plan and build those buildings that they're actually not even coming online until after most of that GI bump is already through the beast.
Right. Yes, Carrie, please.
Yeah, and actually, we did at U of L spend a fair amount of time worrying about this crater that we saw coming because of birth rates in the Depression, and it was not nearly as bad as we anticipated. We actually weathered it just fine. So it was more of a anticipated bump than or not a bump, a crater than we had anticipated. So.
All right. Does anybody have anything they really think that our listeners ought to know about before we leave today? I think we've covered a lot of broad issues facing the universities. I really appreciate all of your work, and for all our visitors here, we're very happy that you came, and I think we'll call it a day. Thank you.